And welcome.
I'm going to start with a disclaimer. Unlike other speakers on your program, I'm not really a specialist on Europe. I don't focus on Europe exclusively or even mainly. I'm an international economist, and as an American, that means that early in my career, I was a Europeanist because that's where the action was, from an American perspective, concerned with the international economy. But over the course of the last 4 decades, the locus of action, while never leaving Europe, has broadened considerably to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, China, Russia. Every decade has brought new significant players into the world economy. So what you'll get from me is some reflections, partly observations of an economist on what's been going on in Europe. I started as a student in England, London School of Economics, 50 years ago. It's worth recalling that this is the 50th anniversary of the Rome Treaty. The treaty which, among 6 countries, as it then was, that created, in the first instance, a customs union in Europe. The Europeans started in January 1st, 1958. The Europeans allowed themselves 15 years to reach the full union, a long transition period, which is typical in changes in trade rules, whether you find it in NAFTA or the international trade rounds. People forget that changes, once decisions are made, the changes are not made instantaneously. We allow long transitions. The Europeans only took 12 years. 1960s were a very good decade from an economic point of view. Things went much more smoothly than Europeans expected, and the worst anxieties, which one found expressed in the mid-50s, did not, in fact, come to pass. The Europeans went on, early on, introduced the Common Agricultural Policy. I'm mentioning the landmarks significant from an economic point of view. The European Monetary System in 1979, the Single European Act, which enlarged the European economic field from being just a customs union to a full economic union, including migration of people and capital, free migration of people and capital. And then in 1991 to the Maastricht Treaty, which set the path in train that led to the common European currency, the euro. By this time, the European Union had grown from 6 to 15 members. Only 12 of them actually adopted the euro. And now, as you know, starting this year, the European Union has 27 members. So over half a century, from 6 to 27, with a respectable waiting list of would-be members. So the Europeans must be doing something right to have had so many people want to join this train, and still people trying to buy tickets. In the area of economic performance, European performance has been, I was going to say respectable, but that is a modest word. It has been outstanding over the last half century. West Europe grew at 2.8% per annum in per capita income. That doesn't sound like much, but when you accumulate it over half a century, it means incomes are 4 times higher now than they were in 1950. Most of the audiences I talked to never knew, and some of you, I'm sure, knew, looking at the amount of gray hair in the room, but some of you may have forgotten just how very poor Europe was in the early 1950s. Greece, Portugal, Spain had per capita incomes lower than India's per capita income today in purchasing power parity terms. And Italy and Ireland were not much above India today. So parts of Europe were very poor. Europe, by any standard, is today a rich society. Europeans are rich. And that's the transformation in economic terms that's taken place over the decade. Interestingly, the richest country in the European Union, if you leave aside Luxembourg, which is really a city with a little bit of garden around it, is now Ireland, one of the poorest countries of Europe in 1950. The richest country is Ireland. Switzerland and Norway are richer than Ireland, but they're both outside the Union. In comparative terms, Europe rose from about half the level of US per capita income in the early 1950s to about 3/4 in these days. Portugal, the poorest member in 1950 of the West European countries, I don't count Romania and Bulgaria in these generalizations, grew from 22% of the US level of income to about half today. Portugal is still the poorest country of the Euro 15, leave aside the Eastern European countries. The sharp rise in income has resulted in radical transformations of European economy and society along many dimensions. I'll just mention a critical one because it's come up several times already. Poor countries are predominantly agricultural countries. That has been true historically. It's still true around the world today. And it was true of Europe in 1950, leaving aside a few countries, the Netherlands, the UK. Agriculture has moved from 50% of the labor force in Italy, for example, in 1950, over 50%, to under 10% today. Dramatic reduction in agriculture as an economic activity, as an engagement of people in earning their livelihoods. And now we've entered a period which gets reflected in lots of anxiety of a decline in manufacturing. And my own view, this is a digression, if you like, from Europe, but it's a generalization that includes Europe. I think manufacturing is going to go the same way as agriculture has done in all rich countries, including the United States, including Japan, Korea. That is to say, it's going to engage fewer and fewer people, even while output continues to grow and change, of course. And the difference is productivity. Productivity growth in agriculture has been just incredible. It's one reason we're able to feed 6.5 billion people in the world today comfortably, better diets today than they had 50 years ago. And that process continues. In my view, the same process is going to occur and is occurring. You see it again first in the United States, but one sees it in Europe and Japan now, in agriculture, in which manufacturing employment declines as a share and indeed in absolute numbers of employment, even while manufacturing output continues to grow. And of course, the reason is advancing technology, the substitution of machines for workers. And in my view, but I speak as a professor and not as somebody who's on the shop floor tomorrow, we should have, from a social point of view, we should have no regrets about these developments. I spent the early part of my life as a farmer. Best thing that ever happened to me was leaving the farm, and that's happily true now of thousands and thousands of not just Americans, but Europeans and Japanese. One of the problems in this area is the average age of farmers in Japan and Europe is growing almost a year. And the reason is that the children of the farmers are sensible enough not to want to go into farming, and they have alternatives. And I think manufacturing will go the same way, and we should not shed any tears over it, in my own view. Of course, it's hard on the particular individuals that lose jobs, but from a social point of view, these are mostly boring, repetitive, often dangerous jobs, and the faster we can automate, to use an old-fashioned word, the manufacturing and release people to do more creative activities, including repairing the machines when they break down, the better off we will all be. But I know that's a very non-politically sensitive statement. The other thing that's another thing I want to mention, because I'm going to come back to it later, the income I gave you has been a big increase in leisure. With higher income, people take more leisure, and the average European work year has declined from over 2,000 hours, probably over 2,100 hours a year, down to around 1,600 hours a year, as leisure is taken in a shorter work week, more vacation time, more personal time, and so forth. So Europeans are now rich. They live comfortable lives with a lot of leisure, with much better health, greater longevity, and of course, the shedding of empires has been long ago and is out of the memory now of most younger Europeans. Curious vignette, the last formal loss of colony was Portugal's loss of Macau, which took place only as recently as 1999. But the Portuguese, after the old man Salazar died in the mid-70s, tried to give away all of their colonies, including Macau, and China said, no, you have to keep it. We're not ready yet. We're not ready. So Portugal was a reluctant colonial power right up until the end of the decade, when China finally said, okay, now's the time. Now that we have Hong Kong back, now's the time to give us Macau back. So it looks like a fantastic success story. It is a fantastic success story. Why then all of the malaise? Why there's a tremendous amount of hand-wringing going on in Europe, about Europe, outside of Europe, and what can we say about the future? Now, from now on, when I talk about Europe, the first point we should say is Europe is actually a very diverse area. With this general success story is a pervasive one, but with important differences among the European countries that have persisted and continue even today. So when I talk about Europe now in my subsequent remarks, I'm really talking about Germany, France, and Italy. The three biggest European countries, the core of Europe. The Nordics are, in economic terms, performing very much better, differently. Netherlands is, in some sense, an honorary Nordic country. Spain has its own dynamism going, and of course, as usual, Britain is an island someplace in the middle of the Atlantic, and is different in Europe, similar in some ways, but different in many ways. So I'm really talking about, but France, Germany, and Italy account for about 60% of the European Union in GDP, and so they continue to be the important economies. Now, economic growth in Europe, although over the last half century, has been outstanding. It's been somewhat lackluster over the last 16 years, with the exceptions of 99, 2000 were pretty good years, and the last 2 years, 2005, 2006, have been pretty good years. And in particular, after years of growing faster than the United States, or at least keeping up with the United States, Europe is now, in terms of growth rates, falling behind the US for about a decade. And it's worth asking, as the Europeans do ask themselves, why is that so? What is going on? And some explanations are much more straightforward than others. One of the most straightforward explanations is simply that European labor forces are growing more slowly than the US labor force has been growing during the last decade, and that, other things being equal, that will tend to pull down the rate of growth of GDP. Not a reason for regret, especially, although I'm going to come back to some implications of that in a moment. It is also true that leisure, that is to say, hours of the year not actually formally being worked, has continued to increase in Europe, as in the United States, but more rapidly in Europe. And now allow me another digression. My own view is that the Europeans are much more sensible than the Americans under this particular heading. We introduced the 40-hour week back in the 1930s. That was 70 years ago, when our income was 1/3 what it is now. And at least in the federal government and in the manufacturing sector of the economy, we're still with a 40-hour week. I actually think that's a nonsense Services are much more flexible, and the work week has declined. I'm counting in rolling in vacation time when I make these observations. So leisure has increased in the US, but not nearly as much as it has in Europe. A question is how much of the increase in Europe has been voluntary and how much has been compulsory. And this is one difference between the Europe, and now I'm talking specifically about this core of Europe, not all of Europe, is that they tend to do things by rule, which are universally applied. So that even people who would like to work more cannot work more, cannot legally work more under European rules, whereas the US, and in this respect, the UK is more like the US, is much more flexible in this regard in terms of accommodating, not perfectly, far from perfectly, I would say, but accommodating differences in personal preferences with regard to the work-leisure trade-off. More worrying than the slowdown in growth per se is the fact that productivity in Europe productivity growth has fallen behind productivity growth in the U.S. after a long and largely successful catch-up phase earlier in the period, and that has resulted again in a lot of hand-wringing, but very little serious action about the educational systems in Europe, about R&D expenditure, about technology advancement, and related to this is a European political system that is reluctant to acknowledge the need in response to constantly changing technology and patterns of demand, the need in a vibrant economy to shed labor from some firms, to redefine jobs, and indeed even to allow unsuccessful firms to fail. We don't have time to go through examples, but if you think of what the U.S. did, we broke up one of our most successful firms, AT&T. IBM was on the brink of bankruptcy, pulled itself back. General Motors, we're watching now with interest, but with no great call for public action in this country. When these issues arose in Europe, tremendous public, that is to say fiscal support for large firms to prevent them from failing, and that has a very serious cost in a dynamic economy. Part of the malaise, I suspect, is the failure, or at least the perceived failure, to compete technologically in the hot areas with the United States. That is to say, information technology in the 80s, computer technology, and more recently biotechnology, and possibly in the future nanotechnology. There are outstanding examples in Europe under each of these headings, but they are much less pervasive, and there's much less innovation, particularly in these sectors, than in the United States, or indeed than in Japan, where Europe's strength has been and continues to be is in the more traditional industries, where innovation continues to take place, but not in the sort of hot button sectors. One of the sources of malaise, although it's not new, it's been around now for about 2 decades, is the high unemployment rates in Europe. And in sharp contrast to the 50s and 60s, where unemployment was falling and then at a very low level for a decade and a half in Europe. For example, last year, which was a good year, unemployment throughout the euro area was 7.5%. It was 8.6% in France, 9.5% in Germany. All of these rates down slightly from what they were a year or two earlier, but versus 4.6% in the US. In my view, there is actually no mystery associated with high European unemployment. And what I find puzzling is why is the reluctance of the European political system and the European public to recognize that they're getting what they pay for, that the high unemployment is a result, deliberate, not a conscious result, but it's a result of deliberate public policy choices. The Europeans, and again, I'm speaking about these three countries, well, I'm really speaking about Germany and France in this respect. Italy's a little different. Pay their unemployed very, very well. And economists take the view, which is supported by lots and lots of evidence, that people in general are not dumb, and they respond to the incentives that they're presented with. And if you have a choice between a not very interesting job to which you have to spend 45 minutes each day or an hour and a half each day commuting to and from, and you can get 90% equivalent wage after taxes by going into the unemployment compensation office once a week, it is not surprising that a certain fraction of the population elects the second option. In fact, if we had that option in the United States, I'm not sure I wouldn't be among them. And so this is the other side of the very generous European welfare system, which is well motivated, but it does have consequences for economic performance and economic results. But there's continual talk in Europe about the undesirability of this high unemployment rate. And I think that talk has some merit to it from psychological and integration into society point of view, but a reluctance to recognize that it is a direct and I think obvious consequence of their own policies. We have some counterexamples now. Spain, which had the highest unemployment rate, recorded unemployment rate not so long ago, a decade or so ago, among the European countries. It's way down, still high in Spain, but it's way down as a result of changing in labor contract practices that the Spanish adopted. And the Netherlands also has had a big reduction. So one sees, and that's one of the advantages of the diversity within Europe, experimentation with changes in public policy, and we get it's a little bit like the states in the United States, so we get to see what things are likely to work and what things are not likely to work. I noticed so far, most of the conversation in this conference has been about the European Union. And I don't want to minimize its importance, but what I'm in effect reminding you is that the European Union is not all there is to Europe. And in fact, most of the key decisions, leave aside trade policy and now leave aside monetary policy for the 13 countries that are in the euro area, are actually still made at the national level. A lot of discussion in Brussels, some action in Brussels. Some of it is actually by treaty compulsory action in Brussels, but most of the key economic decisions are still made at the national level in Europe. I'm quickly running out of time. I want to turn to an issue which has not come up yet and which I think is actually of tremendous importance for the future of Europe, and that is demography. We live in an extraordinary period. Those of us who are as old as I am, and there are some of you in this room, we've seen both the ups and the downs. We saw a tremendous growth in world population growth to a height of nearly 2% a year in the early 60s, and now we're watching, these are worldwide figures, we're watching a decline now to around 1.1% a year worldwide. But what's extraordinary is that in all of the rich countries and some not so rich countries of the world, with the significant and important exception of the United States, the birth rate has essentially crashed. And most rich countries, all rich countries, except the US, are not reproducing themselves in terms of natural birth rate now. And in Western Europe, well, in Europe, including Slavic Europe, including Ukraine and Russia, birth rates have collapsed to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 child per woman of childbearing age. Reproduction ratio is a little over 2. So this is way below reproduction ratio. A lot of discussion of this issue because of its implication for pensions, the fiscal sustainability of pensions, the aging of society, and all of that's entirely appropriate, the focus on the aged and providing health care and pensions and so forth. an aspect of this dimension which I think has been seriously neglected is what is happening at the young end of the population, new entrants to the labor force, which are declining and have been for some years. Germany reached its peak population last year, 2005. Japan will reach its peak population this year, but population has long-term dynamics to it, and longevity is increasing in all of these countries. More interesting, I think, is the changing age composition of population, and it's been true now for some years that the number of young adults in these countries has been falling. And what I want to emphasize is that we, mankind, we have no experience with managing modern economies with declining populations. None. We had World War I, which killed off a lot of men, but remember, when it comes to population dynamics, men are only incidental. It's the number of women. It's the number of women who really count. And Europe recovered from the First World War in about a decade. We have no experience. So Germany and Japan and Italy are really pioneering for all of us, I think, what the challenges are of managing a world with not only with an aging population, but with a declining young population. Just to give you some figures, these are drawn from the U.S. Census Bureau, which does population projections. France, which has a less of an acute problem than others, number of people in their 20s between the year 2000 and the year 2025, so this is taking a quarter-century view, declined by 13%, young adults. Italy by 16%, Germany by 21%, and Italy by a stunning 37%. This has, I think, profound implications for the way economies work. Young people, young adults, are the most flexible members of the labor force. They're the most educated these days. They're flexible both occupationally and geographically. They are the ones who form new households, have children, demand for housing, demand for schools, and so forth. When they enter the labor force, they have to be supplied with the average amount of capital that a worker has in a modern economy these days. And so it's not a surprise to me that investment, compared with a decade or two ago, is down significantly in most of the rich countries. And it's down because demand for housing is down, demand for new schools is down, demand for new equipment in the labor force is down. And I think that the flexibility of these economies to adapt to the changes that are taking place, some driven by what we loosely call globalization, mainly driven by technology and rising incomes with changing tastes. The flexibility of these economies is going to be compromised. By 2025, the number of people over the age of 80 will exceed the number of people under the age of 10 in Italy, and they'll be roughly equal in Germany. The demographer Nick Eberstadt has calculated that if this continues until 2050, 85% of Italian children will have neither siblings nor cousins. And imagine what that does to the proverbial traditional Italian family. I mean, these are big, big changes. They have economic origin, but they have powerful social and sociological, psychological implications, I think. Now, I want to close because I'm supposed to talk about the future of Europe. It happens, and I saw you had it on display out there. It came into my hands just a few weeks ago after I'd agreed to come here, a new book by two US-trained Italian economists, one a colleague of mine, Alberto Alesina, and another a professor at Bocconi University, a leading Italian university, Francesco Giovazzi, called The Future of Europe, Reform or Decline. And their conclusion is a rather stark one, which is that if Europe does not reform seriously, Europe inevitably will decline, not just in economic terms, relative. Europe will remain rich, but it will decline in relative terms, and certainly fall further and further behind the United States. And in their judgment, also will decline in importance politically. And what do they mean by reform? And they go through a litany with many examples of the problems in Europe. I'll just mention one because it struck me. This is the time it takes to collect a check that has bounced. There's a check that has bounced and the time it takes. And they have, where they got these figures, I have no idea. But they do have a footnote. It takes 68 days to go through the judicial procedure and then the foreclosure on property in the United States. Holland actually beats the US by about a week, 54 days. But the same process in Italy, these are two Italians writing, 845 days. With Austria being not far behind at 584 days to collect on a bounced check. Opening a new business takes in the United States, again, I don't know where they got the figures, 4 days and $166. Very, very precise. In Italy, it takes 62 days and $5,012. And not much less in France, 53 days in France. So they're citing these very concrete, or perhaps overly concrete examples for the inflexibilities, the rigidities in European countries, and again, having in mind not all of Europe, but this core of Europe, to economic change of any kind, and the adaptability and so forth. So they conclude the Europeans have to act quickly, in their view, to liberalize product markets. That's been largely done in merchandise trade, but hardly done at all in the service business, particularly the financial sector. Banking and utilities, energy was mentioned earlier. Liberalize the labor market, particularly rules governing the labor market, and protect workers, not protect jobs. The idea, shift the focus. We protect the workers. We don't protect the jobs. If a job should be eliminated, let's eliminate it. Make sure the hardship is mitigated to the individuals in it. They're very big on immigration in Europe. They see the, not a solution, but a mitigation of the demographic problems that I mentioned is a much more active, proactive immigration policy. Europe has to get its act together. They propose an EU green card, actually, which is skill-based and so forth. R&D and universities, both archaic practices. And the Lisbon Agenda talks about the need, recognizes the need to pump more public money into R&D and into universities. No, 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 no. That's got it all wrong, say Alesina and Giavazzi. The problem is not too little money. It is the inflexibility of rules and the governance of allocation of resources under R&D, and they go through, and in universities. Most, in these countries, the university professors are civil servants, operate under civil service rules. For example, the universities have very little autonomy. Students don't pay tuition, which they see as a big problem, actually. Reform the judicial system. I've already mentioned the check clearing business. And finally, fiscal policy. Taxes, that was alluded to. Taxes are very high in Europe by US standards. Americans think they're overtaxed, but among all of the rich countries, America shares the position with Japan of being the most lightly taxed, even the Swiss. And Switzerland's hardly a country in the conventional sense of the term. Even the Swiss tax themselves more than the Americans do. And I think these two authors, they don't focus mainly on the US. They would happy to be they think we starve the public sector too much, but they think the Europeans spend much too much on public activities and spend it badly, and that they could preserve their welfare system with much more efficient allocation. Now, I've talked about Europe focusing on public policy. One should not, just as one should not confuse Europe with the EU alone, one should not confuse Europeans with Europe. Europeans are people of European origin. And if you take a global view, some of the most successful firms in the world are European. Siemens, Philips, one could go down the list. In fact, 16 out of the 30 biggest firms in terms of revenue in the world today are European. They tend not to be quite as profitable as American firms of comparable size, but nonetheless, they're very successful firms. But when you look at each of these firms and the ones that are not in the list, the successful firms tend to be the ones that are going global. They have learned how to adapt to and thrive in a rapidly global changing environment. They happen to be headquartered in Europe, but more and more of their economic activity is outside of Europe. Sales, of course, but also procurement, search for capital, and so on. And a big problem, especially in Germany and Italy, where a lot of the strength of the economy has been small, family-owned firms, the famous Mittelstand in Germany. The founders are getting older, dying off, and what's going to happen to these firms? They don't have an orderly, and often the sons don't exist, or they don't, sons or daughters don't want to go into the family business. So there's an important succession issue of what has been the most, or one of the most vibrant parts in the last decades of the German and the Italian. Same problem does not exist in France. They have far fewer smaller firms in France. So the challenge to Europe is really to make the next quarter century or half century as successful as the past 50 years have been. And a large part of that challenge, I think, is coping with the dramatic demographic changes that are taking place in Europe. And that will require, according to my two Italian authors, very serious ways in the way in which Europeans do business. What David Caleo last evening called with approval the European system for reciprocal appeasement, without using that term, but they have captured the idea. They see it as a big disadvantage for Europe. They see it as a process by which well-placed insiders protect their position against change and against outsiders. And so you have mostly older, highly unionized workers protecting their jobs. One consequence is reluctance of German and Italian and French firms to take on new employees, because employees are in effect tenured, and you don't take on a tenured employee employed lightly. So they see this as a protectionist psychology, not in the international trade sense, but in a established institution sense, and that they think needs to be changed, or Europe's decline is inevitable. Thank you.